episode, we're going to discuss the core political ideas of liberalism, and in particular the question, to what extent is liberalism a cohesive political ideology? Predominantly, debates within liberalism are had between the classical liberals and modern liberals. Whilst in some issues there are some agreements, in others, as we shall see, there's vast disagreement. Starting with the theme of state intervention, classical liberals advocate for a minimal state where government's social responsibility is limited. Governments morally and practically are only to be expected to provide particular services to citizens, such as the police and military, to protect private property and the stability of the state. In contrast, modern liberals advocate for a more activist and interventionist state. They accept, some reluctantly, that in order for individuals to achieve true self-determination, the state must facilitate the conditions for individuals to help themselves. In this sense, the state is thus bigger and called an enabling state. However, it's important to remember that all liberals, whether from the classical or modern tradition, agree that some form of the state should exist for practical and normative reasons. This contrasts with the various forms of anarchism. This is because all liberals believe that the individual must be protected from a Hobbesian state of nature when no state exists. Famously, Thomas Paine called the state a necessary evil to reflect this belief. Isaiah Berlin, a liberal philosopher, in 1969 gave a speech titled Two Concepts of Liberty, which are very helpful in unlocking where and why classical and modern liberals, whilst appreciating that the individual must come first over the collective, have very different conceptions of what liberty means in practice. Classical liberals believe in negative liberty. The individual is free insofar as he or she is left alone. Freedom in this sense is the absence of external constraints on the individual. J.S. Mill suggested that over himself, over his own body, and his mind, the individual is sovereign, to reflect this idea of negative liberty. Conversely, modern liberals adopt positive liberty, the idea of self-mastery or self-realization. Freedom to them is the achievement of autonomy or the development of human capacities. They critique classical liberals' more narrow-minded conception of liberty to be merely the freedom to starve. Whilst classical and modern liberals adopt different interpretations of freedom, as exposed by Isaiah Berlin's distinction between negative and positive freedom, it's important to appreciate that all liberals put the individual first over the collective. This contrasts with libertarians who view any form of government intervention into the lives of individuals as a form of tyranny, and for example, see taxation as a form of theft. These libertarian ideas that contrast with modern and classical liberals can be found in the works of Robert Nozick. So whilst liberals would put the individual first over the collective, socialists would disagree and argue that an infringement on the wealthy is justified for the common good of the collective. For all liberals, it's paramount to protect individual liberty. This contrasts with ideologies such as totalitarianism, which sacrifice individual liberty for the sake of state security and stability. However, on some themes, it's difficult to find much, if any, distinction between classical and modern liberals when it comes to ideas such as constitutionalism and the foundations of liberal democracy. In terms of constitutionalism and liberal democracy, there's not much of a division between classical liberals and modern liberals, as all liberals value that the practice of limited government should be brought about by a single authoritative document, like a codified constitution, where the powers and duties and functions of government institutions are constituted as higher law, in the form of a written document that is evaluated by the courts. Liberals support constitutionalism through a desire to protect liberty through the establishment of internal and external checks on government power. As Montesquieu articulated, power should be a check to power. In addition, this links to liberals' conception of human nature, as liberals fear power and arbitrary government, egoism and power equals corruption, and as Lord Acton articulated, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Liberals believe in an independent judiciary that can strike down laws optimistic about human nature and believe in the rationality and perfectibility of the individual as a result of the Enlightenment. They have a strong bias against paternalism, not only because paternalism prevents individuals from making their own moral choices and, if necessary, from learning from their own mistakes, but because it also creates a prospect that those invested with the responsibility of others will abuse their position for their own ends. However, when it comes to individualism, classical liberals and modern liberals diverge. Classical liberals believe in egoistical individualism, the idea that people owe nothing to society and in turn are owed nothing by that society. And this in turn contrasts with modern liberals who believe in developmental individualism, a form of individualism that prioritizes human In terms of the political economy and welfare, there is a divergence between classical liberals and modern liberals. Classical liberals of the 18th and 19th century believed in laissez-faire economics and opposed all forms of factory legislation, for example, including restrictions on the employment of children, limits to the number of hours worked, and any regulation of working conditions. They had a fundamental belief in market fundamentalism, where absolute faith in the market mechanics to offer solutions to all economic and social problems, and believed that the unrestrained pursuit of profit would ultimately lead to great benefit for all in society. This political economic ideology contrasted with modern liberals of the 20th century who adopted a more pragmatic approach to the economy. They were willing to adopt Keynesian economics. Modern liberals reluctantly abandoned laissez-faire ideas to deal with the increasing complexity of industrial capital economies. In the General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money in 1936, Keynes challenged classical liberal thinking by suggesting that at times of high unemployment, governments must reflate their economies by either increasing public spending or cutting taxes. Whilst all liberals subscribe to the belief in equality of opportunity, the idea that each and every individual should have the same chance to rise and fall within a society, liberal thinkers have disagreed about how these broad principles of justice should be applied in practice. Classical liberals have endorsed strict meritocracy on both economic and moral grounds. Economically, they place heavy stress on the need for incentives. Morally, justice requires that unequal individuals are not treated equally. However, modern liberals have taken social justice to imply belief in some measure of social equality. For example, in A Theory of Justice, in 1970, John Rawls argued that economic equality is only justifiable if it works to benefit the poorest in a society. Looking at global liberalism in the present day, the majority of liberals support globalization. However, it's important to appreciate that the classical liberals of the 18th and 19th century, while supporting forms of globalization such as free trade, were more isolationist than their more modern counterparts. Liberals support the idea of global liberalism because of their belief in the universalization of human rights and individual liberties. No matter what your race, religion, ethnicity, creed, or nationality, all liberals believe that you are endowed with inalienable human rights. This is why, in theory, liberals, whilst not always in practice, support democratic institutionalism and global democratic supranational structures like the EU, UN, and WTO because they recognise that all individuals have human rights. All liberals believe that nation states should be democratic and individuals should have the rights and freedoms to elect and reject their political representatives. This is because they believe that political legitimacy comes from below up and that power needs to be consented to by the polity. This international support of democracy comes hand in hand with liberal support of global capitalism, because they believe that growth and prosperity comes with increased globalization and increased free trade between nations. In addition, liberal support sustaining the international global capitalist system because it decreases the risk